20-year-old Quintin Jones crushed his 83-year-old gray tan skull with a baseball bat for $30. The victim's own sister would later beg the state not to execute him. This wasn't just another death row case. This was a story that would challenge everything America thought it knew about justice, forgiveness, and family bonds. In Texas, where executions happen more than anywhere else in the country, victim families typically demand the ultimate punishment. But Maddie Long broke that mold in the most extraordinary way possible. "I have forgiven him," she wrote to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. "I love him very much." The sister of the murdered woman was pleading for her nephew's life. The same nephew who had bludgeoned her sister to death in a drug-fueled rage over pocket change. But there was more to this story. Much more. Because what happened inside Quintin Jones over 22 years on death row would transform him into someone his own family barely recognized. Someone who would touch the lives of inmates, guards, and even strangers on the outside. Someone who would force an entire state to confront an impossible question. When the victim's family forgives, when they beg for mercy, when they say execution would cause them more pain than healing, what then? Does justice belong to the state or to those who lost everything? And what happens when a cold-blooded killer becomes something else entirely? Texas was about to find out. But first, we need to go back to where it all began, on a September night in Fort Worth when family loyalty died in a pool of blood. September 11, 2001. While America watched the Twin Towers fall, a family in Fort Worth, Texas, was dealing with their own devastating loss. 2 years earlier, on that same date, September 11th, 1999, their world had been shattered in ways that would take decades to understand. 83-year-old Berthena Bryant lay in her casket, her family still struggling to comprehend how their Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings had led to this moment. The gentle woman who had raised children and great-nephews, who had opened her door to family members in need, who had never harmed a soul in her long life. The funeral director had done his best, but there was only so much he could do to hide what had happened to her head. Her great-nephew Quintin Jones sat in a Tarrant County jail cell, facing capital murder charges. The same young man who had called her auntie, who had played in her backyard as a child, who had come to her just hours before her death asking for help. The same young man who had beaten her to death when she said no. But this story isn't just about what Quintin Jones did that night. It's about what happened next over the following 22 years. That would challenge every assumption about crime, punishment, and the power of human transformation. Because sometimes, the most shocking thing about a murder case isn't the crime itself. Sometimes it's what comes after. Quintin Philemon Jones wasn't born a killer. But by September 1999, drugs had carved out everything inside him that once resembled a human being. At 20 years old, Jones was a walking pharmacy of destruction. Heroin and cocaine had turned him into something his family no longer recognized, a hollow-eyed ghost who showed up only when he needed money. His great-aunt Berthena Bryant had watched this transformation with a quiet heartbreak that only family members understand. She remembered the little boy who used to run through her house, laughing at cartoons, eating sandwiches she made with crust cut off just the way he liked them. That child was gone now, replaced by this stranger with shaking hands and desperate eyes. Bryant lived alone at 1128 West Berry Street in Fort Worth. At 83, she was a family matriarch, the one everyone turned to when times got hard. Her Social Security checks barely covered her own needs, but she had never turned away a family member in crisis. The week before her death, Jones had started coming by more frequently. His addiction had progressed to that dangerous stage where the drugs controlled everything. The beast inside him demanded constant feeding, and he had run out of legal ways to feed it. September 10th, 1999. Jones knocked on Bryant's door just after sunset. He needed money. Emergency, he said, just a loan. But Bryant had learned the hard way that addiction makes liars out of everyone it touches. "I can't help you this time, baby," she told him, using the pet name she had called him since childhood. "I just can't." Jones stood on her porch, his body screaming for another hit, his mind calculating how much money she might have hidden in her bedroom drawer. As withdrawal symptoms clawed at his nervous system, a terrible idea began to form. He knew her routine. He knew she would be alone. He knew where she kept her money. The beast inside him whispered that $30 could buy enough drugs to make the pain stop. Bryant watched her great-nephew walk away that evening. Unaware she was looking at him for the last time, while they were both still who they used to be. She locked her door and went to bed, but sleep came fitfully. Something in his eyes had been different this time. By morning, the decision was made. Jones woke up sick, shaking, and completely convinced that his gray tan's $30 was the only thing standing between him and relief. He had a baseball bat. He knew she would be alone, and the beast inside him was starving. September 11, 1999, 7:30 p.m. Berthena Bryant was getting ready for bed when she heard the familiar knock. Through the peephole, she saw Quintin shifting his weight from foot to foot like he always did when he was hurting for drugs. She shouldn't have opened it. "Auntie, please," Jones said. "I just need a little help. I'm sick." "I already told you no," she said quietly. "You need to go home and get some rest." But Jones wasn't listening anymore. The withdrawal had reached that crucial tipping point where rational thought gets overpowered by physical desperation. He pushed past her into the house. Jones went straight to her bedroom, searching through drawers with frantic efficiency. Bryant followed, pleading with him to stop, trying to reach whatever remained of the child she had once known. The baseball bat was in his hands before Bryant fully comprehended what was happening. Investigators would later determine he had brought it with him, hidden it outside until he decided talking wouldn't work. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditation fueled by desperation. The first blow caught Bryant completely off guard. 83 years old, barely 5 feet tall, she had no defense against a 20-year-old man driven by drugs and determination. She felt the floor of her own bedroom. But Jones didn't stop there. He raised the bat again, and again, and again. When it was over, Berthena Bryant lay dead in a pool of blood. Her skull had been crushed so thoroughly that the medical examiner would later struggle to catalog all the fractures. Jones found her purse on the kitchen counter. Inside, $37 in bills and some loose change. He took the cash and left everything else. $37. That's what Berthena Bryant's life was worth to a drug addict who had lost every trace of his humanity. Within hours, he had spent every dollar on drugs while his gray tan's body lay cooling in a house where she had once made him sandwiches with the crusts cut off. The next morning, when Bryant didn't answer her phone, family members found the back door standing open. The scream that came when they discovered her body could be heard 3 houses away. Police arrived to find one of the most brutal crime scenes veteran officers had ever witnessed. Within hours, they identified Quintin Jones as their primary suspect. For 11 days, he remained free. On September 22, 1999, Jones was arrested in Fort Worth, found passed out in a crack house with needle marks still fresh on his arms. During his initial questioning, Jones showed no remorse. When detectives described Bryant's injuries, when they showed him photographs of the crime scene, his expression never changed. The person capable of love and regret was still buried somewhere beneath the addiction. It would take years for that person to resurface. The trial began in July 2002 in Tarrant County, Texas. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: DNA, blood spatter analysis, witness testimony, and his own confession. The jury convicted him of capital murder and sentenced him to death. Jones began his journey on death row in 2001, where he would spend the next 20 years filing appeals that were repeatedly denied. Death row was supposed to be the end of Quintin Jones' story. Instead, it became the beginning of something nobody expected. A transformation so complete that it would challenge everything his family thought they knew about justice and redemption. The change didn't happen overnight. For the first few years, Jones remained the same hollow-eyed addict, just without access to drugs. But sobriety has a way of forcing people to confront truths they spent years avoiding. Slowly, as his mind cleared, Jones began to remember who Berthena Bryant had really been. Not just a source of money when he was desperate, but the woman who had raised him when his own parents couldn't. The woman who had loved him unconditionally until the day he killed her for $37. The guilt, when it finally hit, nearly destroyed him. Jones began writing letters to family members, to victim advocacy groups, to anyone who might help him understand how to live with what he had done. Most went unanswered, but one person kept writing back. Maddie Long, Berthena Bryant's sister, and his own great-aunt. Long had spent the first years after her sister's murder consumed by grief and rage. She had supported the death penalty. But as years passed, something unexpected began growing in her heart. "I started having dreams about Berthena," Long later explained. "And in these dreams, she wasn't angry. She was sad for all of us, including Quintin." The correspondence between Long and Jones began tentatively. She wrote about her sister, about their childhood together. He wrote about his memories of Bryant, about his guilt, about the person he was trying to become. Gradually and possibly, these two people connected by violence began connecting through something else entirely. Jones's transformation accelerated. He completed his GED, then a bachelor's degree through correspondence courses. He began counseling other inmates, helping them write letters to their families, mediating disputes that might have turned violent. He became, against all odds, a force for good in one of America's most hopeless places. But the most remarkable change was happening in Maddie Long herself. The woman who had once demanded Jones's execution was beginning to see him as family again. She started visiting him, sitting across from him in the prison visiting room, looking into eyes that now reflected genuine human emotion instead of drug-addled emptiness. When I saw him again after all those years, Long remembered, "I saw the little boy I used to know. He was still in there, buried under all that guilt and pain. But he was still there." Other family members began to follow Long's lead. Not all of them. Some would never forgive Jones. But enough family members experienced their own transformations that something unprecedented began to emerge. A murder victim's family actively working to save their killer's life. May 2021. After 22 years on death row, Quintin Jones received his execution date, May 19th, 2021. But this death penalty case was unlike any Texas had seen before. Maddie Long, now in her 80s, began the most important fight of her life. Not for justice, but for mercy. She wrote to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, "I have forgiven him, and I love him very much. I do not want him to be executed." One by one, family members added their voices to an unprecedented chorus of forgiveness. These weren't naive people unaware of the crime's brutality. They were the people who had lived with the consequences every day for 2 decades. They knew exactly what he had done, and they were begging Texas not to kill him for it. But Texas had never commuted a death sentence based on victim family wishes alone. The case attracted national attention. Legal arguments flew back and forth. Each appeal was denied. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals refused to halt the execution. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. The media coverage intensified. National news networks interviewed Maddie Long, this frail woman in her 80s fighting to save the life of the man who had killed her sister. "They asked me how I could forgive him," Long told reporters. "But holding on to hate was killing me too. Forgiveness didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it set me free. Now if they execute him, it'll be like losing family all over again." On May 14th, 5 days before the scheduled execution, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles announced their decision. By a vote of 7-0, they rejected Jones's clemency petition. No explanation was provided. Maddie Long said simply, "I don't understand how they can ignore what we want. Berthena was my sister. If anyone should have a say in this, shouldn't it be us?" Conclusion: the execution and legacy. May 19, 2021, 6 p.m., Huntsville, Texas. Quintin Jones was led into the death chamber. He was 41 years old, 21 years older than when he committed the crime that brought him here, and a fundamentally different person. Among the witnesses was 84-year-old Maddie Long, tears streaming down her face, about to watch the state kill the man she had forgiven and come to love again. When asked for his final statement, Jones spoke clearly. "I want to thank my family for all their love and support throughout the years. To the family of Berthena Bryant, I hope I left everyone a plate of food full of happy memories, happiness, and no sadness. I love you all." At 6:40 p.m., Quintin Jones was pronounced dead. "I feel like I failed him," Long said after the execution. "Berthena raised him, loved him, and I couldn't save him. Now I've lost them both. The case sparked renewed debate about the role of victim families in death penalty decisions. Legal scholars question whether Texas had missed an opportunity to demonstrate mercy when the people most harmed by the original crime had specifically requested it. Jones's 22 years on death row had transformed him from a drug-addled killer into a mentor, peacemaker, and source of hope for others. His letters and interactions had touched hundreds of lives. But perhaps the most profound legacy lies in the extraordinary capacity for human forgiveness demonstrated by Maddie Long and other family members. People asked me how I could forgive him. Long reflected months after the execution. But I asked them, how could I not? Hate was eating me alive. Forgiveness set me free. Quintin Jones's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about second chances, about the possibility of redemption, about what we owe each other as human beings. He was undeniably the man who committed a brutal murder for $37. He was also undeniably the man who spent 22 years trying to atone, helping others, and earning the forgiveness of the family he had devastated. Both versions of Quintin Jones were real. Both versions matter. And the tension between them will continue to challenge anyone willing to grapple with the complexities of justice, mercy, and what it means to be human. The question this story leaves us with is simple but profound. When someone genuinely changes, when they demonstrate remorse and work to make amends, when even their victim's family forgive them, what then? What does justice require? What does mercy demand? These are questions worth wrestling with, questions that don't have easy answers, questions that force us to examine our own capacity for forgiveness and our own beliefs about whether people can truly change.